let's begin by reading the last portion of chapter 7. So chapter 7, verses 20 through 28. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able for all time to save those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, unstained, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. He did this once for all when he offered up himself. Indeed, the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So last week we ended, we actually hadn't gotten very far in this section. We had only discussed the surety of a better covenant in verse 22. So, and we said that it was really a double surety. The one surety is the oath, and the other surety is Christ offering himself, his sacrifice at the cross. How has that, what is there in, this makes Jesus the surety of a better covenant, to make it clear that that's what he means.
Would you ask that question again?
How is it that Jesus becomes the surety of a better covenant? I mean, how is his sacrifice of himself at the cross involved here?
Does it have anything to do with oath and no oath? He had an oath, the oath of the Father in back of him. Does that?
That's the double. That's the second surety. But his sacrifice is the first surety. How has that become a surety?
It was one sacrifice for all time, not daily sacrifice or yearly sacrifice.
Right, but how is sacrifice at all a surety?
Isn't that the role? Wasn't that the role of a priest to offer gifts and sacrifices?
Yeah, exactly. That's we always have to keep going back to that priests offer sacrifices. And so the sacrifice of the Levitical priests is I think you can call it a temporary surety that sort of alleviates sin until the next time there has to be a sacrifice, which is later in the day, in the morning, the great sacrifice on the day of sacrifices on the Day of Atonement. But this is a surety of a better covenant because it's the high priest who lives forever who's offering himself as a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's really critically important. Sacrifice is at the heart of most systems of worship. Remember Gandhi saying, sacrifice, worship without sacrifice is an absurdity of the modern age. And, our what, Mary?
Our separated brethren.
Yeah, and our separated brethren have removed the sacrifice. He mentions that Jesus did this once for all when he offered up himself. As Catholics, we're accused of, on the one hand, keeping Jesus on the cross because Jesus, on the crucifix, Jesus is on the cross. And because at the Eucharist is viewed as a sacrifice. So is this a violation? Does this contradict Hebrews? Are we incorrect or ignoring Hebrews?
I think Christ's words are more important than anything else. And his words were to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And all four had pretty much the same wording in there. It was pretty close in the wording, so all four gospels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember John's.
John has only three. John has no Last Supper discourse. It's the three synoptics in 1 Corinthians.
After I said four, I thought, wait a minute, John.
Yeah, John has the Bread of Life discourse, which is in many ways more stark. I mean, when Jesus is initially talking about being fed by God, and the feeding is clearly refers to learning. And then he changes tone and language and says that whoever does not eat my flesh or drink my blood have no life, and the flesh, whatever the whatever that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. He changes language there and uses in the Greek, the word used is sarx, which is a very sort of physical kind of generally non-literal word. And then he speaks about eating my flesh, and he uses the verb trogo, which is a phrase not used in fine dining. It refers to animals eating and gnawing and munching and devouring things. Very crude language. Are we sacrificing Christ over and over again? How is this one sacrifice, as the author says? If we believe that Christ is present in the Eucharist, or a sacrifice that's being presented to God the Father. Our separated brethren will typically, use, if they know about this verse and the other references in Hebrews, he makes a number of them, will use this as evidence of against the Eucharist.
I keep thinking about the fact that when we're doing the sacrifice, we're offering our sacrifice along with Christ's sacrifice. That's the time.
Right. That's very important. The important the important, really important thing is that we're offering ourselves as a living sacrifice as well, combining that with Christ's sacrifice to offer that back to God the Father. But what about that Christ sacrifice that we're combining with? Is that a new sacrifice? And why, if it's not a new sacrifice, why isn't it a new sacrifice?
Well, it's a once and for all. Unlike what the high priest did.
Then how come we're appear to be doing it over again?
Well, Jesus is with us in the Mass. So he did it so that he lives forever, and then that gives us hope for eternity too.
Mm-hmm. But how isn't this a new sacrifice?
Can I try and shut me up when you feel the need? While you were asking the question, I kept thinking of our birth when you're born once, but you celebrate it every year. Your birthday. You are not reborn, but you celebrate your birthday. And for some reason or other, when I thought of it initially, this related to the Eucharist in Christ. Christ died on a cross once and he offered his body once, but it's like the birthday, we are re-celebrating it whenever we receive the Eucharist. I don't know how better to say it, but that's the thought that ran through my head.
So, George, I think you came very, very close. The difference between celebrating your birthday is that, observing your birthday celebration every year is that you don't bring your birth into the present.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus says to do this in memory of me. That I think is a version from Matthew and 1 Corinthians. Do this in memory of me. And the word for memory, so we see it as, sentimentality. It's the thought that looks back to the event. So I'm going to remember Christ dying on the cross. So the thought looks back to the event. The Greek word is anamnesis. And that it's a very important word because it doesn't simply mean fond recollection, sentimentality. It doesn't mean the thought looks back to the event. It means that the event is made real and brought into the present. So it's the event that creates the thought and not vice versa. So the event is made real, brought into the present so that we can participate in it, and then is projected into the future. So this is anamnesis is the basis of the Jewish celebration of the Exodus, the Passover event. That's an anamnesis. And it's important that it's an anamnesis because the Exodus really looks forward to the cross. Just as Moses led his people out of bondage into the promised land, Jesus leads his people out of the bondage of worldly kingdoms into the kingdom of God. So just to take the celebration of the Exodus event, Passover, is happens in the Seder. And traditionally, the youngest person in the Seder asks the leader of the Seder, how is this night different from every other night? And the point of the question is that this night that's different is the night, the Exodus, the night of Passover meal, which is now brought into the present. And we're participating in the Passover event. Then follows the history of the Passover event and the ritual drinking of wine as a sealing of the covenant, a reconfirmation of the covenant, and then concluding, especially since the event evolved with, particularly with Jews in the diaspora, ending with, and I'll see you next year in Jerusalem, so that God's promise God will regather his people. God will renew his promise of a land overflowing with milk and honey, to which his people can return and regather. So that's anamnesis. The event is brought into the present, made real. We can participate in it, projected to the future. And so in the Eucharist, the cross is made real. We're taken back to it. It's brought into the present as if we're present at the cross. And so Jesus' sacrifice is not made new. The language of the church is that it's represented. The same sacrifice, the one sacrifice, is brought into the present and presented over again to us so that we can participate in it, so that we can then sacrifice ourselves, and so then that our sacrifice can then be offered to God the Father. And the point of this whole thing is that through doing this consciously, if it's simply kind of done, as a matter of routine, it's of no value whatsoever. But the point of it, doing it consciously, is that through that sacrifice, by combining our sacrifice with that of Christ, we receive an outpouring of God's grace. And in the process, we can become transformed and grow more and more in the likeness and image of God, so that we can fulfill the mission of imitating Christ in the world. So that, in sort of a nutshell, is the why Christ's sacrifice is not, we're not sacrificing Christ again, as many of our separated brethren say. And this is a fundamental, there's a fundamental dogma, fundamental tenet, not only of Catholicism, but of all of pre-Reformation religions. All of them focus on the Eucharist as a representation of Christ's sacrifice. All of them based the representation on anamnesis. That's true of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Church of the East, the Eritrean church, the Armenian church, etc. All of them. So that's really a doctrine that we share with all of our pre-Reformation brethren. There are also videos on the Eucharist. I think that there's a Eucharist playlist. So I think that they go into much more detail. We started with verse 20, the oath, and then for the last time, the author cites Psalm 110, verse 4 in 21. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. But he suddenly drops out Melchizedek. Melchizedek is gone. Why did he drop out Melchizedek? Poor Melchizedek.
Because Christ replaced him and was a better version.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
He didn't need Melchizedek's example anymore.
right. He doesn't need Melchizedek's example anymore. Since he's now, so previously he's only now introduced this oath. And he had talked about the oath to Abraham. He had talked about the oath to the Exodus, the negative oath really to the Exodus generation, that they would not enter his rest. So with the oath, he probably wants to make it clear that the oath doesn't apply to Melchizedek also. So you will be a priest forever in the likeness of Melchizedek. So the one who is the priest in Melchizedek's likeness is the one who receives the oath, which is to say, Christ receives the oath, but Melchizedek doesn't. Exodus chapter 29 and Leviticus chapter 8 outline the ordination ceremony. And so there's a preparation of sacrificial offerings, there's a washing of the person to be ordained, there's a putting on of garments, the high priest for everything, including the belt, turban, and crown. Then there's the ordaining ceremony, ordination ceremony, and then there's certain sacrifices over a 7-day period. But what's clearly missing is that there's no oath even by the person being ordained.
Mm-hmm.
So no oath whatsoever. So priests become priests without an oath. And so the only basis of their priesthood is the instruction to Moses in Exodus chapter 28, verse 1. Then bring near to you Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the sons of Israel to serve me as priests. Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. And that's the basis for the priesthood. And of course, they died. Verse 22, with the surety clause, this makes Jesus the surety of a better covenant. Remember earlier he had said on verse 18, on the one hand, the former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. The other, a better hope, is introduced through which we draw near to God. And then here he says the surety of a better covenant. So he emphasizes the linkage between the priesthood and the law, and therefore implies that the change in priesthood, which grows out of the old priesthood and the law, gives rise to a newer and better priesthood and law. So there's an organic relationship between them.
So it gives rise to a new priesthood and a new covenant.
Right. And so that's also another reason why he didn't mention Melchizedek. Just remember, it says Melchizedek brought out bread and wine. So although the Father saw that as foreshadowing the Eucharist, in all probability, the author didn't see it as foreshadowing the Eucharist, since his focus, not that seeing it as foreshadowing the Eucharist is, particularly wrong, but that the author's focus is on a system of sacrifice. And so we have the Levitical system, which is a system of sacrifice, the Mosaic law, which is heavily concerned with the priesthood and a sacrificial system with other stuff built on top of it. So Melchizedek is clearly, in his encounter with Abram, was clearly not involved in sacrifice. And so that makes him a type that reflects the heaven reality, but not a type that gives rise to a greater reality. But also, this is verse 22 is the first time that the word covenant, diatheke, is used. It's used 17 times in Hebrews, and it's only used up to 3 times in any other New Testament book. And so you'll see that the new covenant is going to be the focus of the next 3 chapters. So the usual word in Greek for covenant is syntheke, and the author instead uses diatheke. Diatheke is used in the Septuagint to mean the covenant between God and his people. But its use differs from classical Greek, where it means last will and testament.
Mm. How do you spell that word?
Diatheke.
Theke.
The significant thing about that, and this is something to keep an eye on as we continue to read, is that the author uses it in both senses. So in chapters 9, 10, 12, and 13, we're going to find him referring to the Testament. And at one point he says something like, and I don't have it written down exactly, but a change in covenant requires a death of the testator. So he's using both sentences.
Can I clarify something? You said
Yeah.
the word for both Are you talking both Old and New Covenant, or are you talking, what's both?
Both meanings of meaning covenant and meaning testament.
Got it. Thank
So the New Testament, for example, could be considered the New Covenant, but it's so and this is, sort of really interesting. The use of diatheke in the other New Testament books use the classic Greek sense of testament, and the author uses both.
Okay, thank you.
It actually says something about the degree to which all of the New Testament writers were Hellenized.
Were what?
Hellenized,
Colonized.
yeah. Even Matthew, who was, well, we know that he uses both the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, depending on which one's convenient for him, as well as, and he sometimes combines the two in a single quotation. We know Paul uses whichever one is convenient for him. So we have a new covenant. We have, last week we read chapter 31 of Jeremiah. Does everyone remember chapter 31 of Jeremiah?
It's in my old book. I started my new book tonight.
That'll do it. So maybe would be useful to review covenants. So does anyone know offhand what covenants there are?
There are quite a few. I know that. Starting back with Adam and Eve.
I'm not sure that there's a covenant there.
It seems to me, maybe not, but I know there's one with Noah, but I thought there was one back with Adam and Eve. Forgive me if I'm wrong.
There is a promise, I think you could say, the first creation story: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. But I'm not sure. So that's, I think, a command and a promise. I'm not sure that I would call it a covenant. A covenant is typically seen as an agreement between two parties, although the first thing identified as a covenant isn't particularly an agreement. It falls more into the promise category. So the first one is in Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 15, after the flood.
Was it when Noah built the altar?
It's after that,
Okay.
verse 8. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with you, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. So ordinarily a covenant is sealed in blood. The problem here is that this covenant, in this case, is with not only Noah as a representative of humankind, but also with all of the animals and insects and things that were in the ark. So probably a sacrifice is not exactly called for or a little cumbersome. Spiders sacrificing. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. And we can stop there. So that's I think, the first covenant. And incidentally, that verse is of theological significance for some, because it's used to prove that global warming is a hoax, because God will not destroy the earth.
Well, God's not, we are.
Yeah.
Well, that's a little detail, very tiny. Yeah, I mean, it's a completely stupid interpretation of scripture. But what can you?
Yeah.
So we should stop, and so we'll continue and probably finish this section next week.